The joke lasted about 4 seconds. That was how long it took for Harlan Voss to point at the man pushing the cleaning cart down the hall, laugh in a way that expected everyone else to laugh with him, and say, loud enough for the entire conference room to hear through the open door, "Hey, why don't we ask the janitor? Maybe he's got opinions on the Meridian deal too." A few people smiled. One junior associate actually chuckled, the kind of laugh you give when you're not sure what else to do with your face. The man with the cart stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He finished guiding the cart past the doorway, set the brake with one foot the way he always did, and then he turned. His name was Bernard Okafor, and he was 61 years old, and he was wearing gray coveralls with a small embroidered patch above the left breast pocket that said Facilities, Vantage Tower. His hair had gone mostly white at the temples. His hands were the kind of hands that had done a great deal of work over a great many years. He looked at Harlan Voss the way a man looks at weather. Not with judgment, not with anger, just with calm recognition of what it was. "I heard you mention Meridian," Bernard said. Harlan Voss was the chief investment officer of Caldwell Capital Partners, one of the largest private equity firms operating out of Atlanta. He was 44 years old, Yale MBA, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his professional life been seriously wrong about anything, or so he believed. He blinked now. The smile didn't leave his face, but it changed quality. It became the smile of a man deciding whether to be amused or annoyed. "Sure," Harlan said, leaning back in his chair. He gestured toward the open door with his pen. "Come on in, tell us what you think." There were 11 people in that conference room. 5 were senior partners. 2 were analysts who had been awake for most of the previous 36 hours, preparing materials for this exact meeting. 1 was the firm's outside legal counsel. 1 was a financial model so complicated it took 2 monitors to display it. And then there was Bernard Okafor, who walked through the door in his gray coveralls and stood at the end of the table and looked at the document spread across it. He looked at them for a long moment. No one spoke. "That's the Meridian Media Group acquisition," Bernard said. "You're thinking about buying them." "Very observant," Harlan said. The room gave him the polite laugh he was looking for. Bernard's eyes moved across the documents methodically. Revenue projections, debt structure summary, comparable transactions. He had not touched anything. He was simply reading, upside down, from the far end of a 12-foot conference table. "Your entry multiple is off," he said. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Harlan set his pen down. "I'm sorry?" "You've modeled the acquisition at 8.4 times EBITDA," Bernard said. "But Meridian's trailing EBITDA is inflated by 2 one-time items: the real estate sale from their Nashville property in Q2 and the insurance settlement from the Denver incident last year. Strip those out and you're actually buying at closer to 11.1 times. That changes your return profile considerably." No one moved. Bernard glanced at the analyst closest to him, a young woman named Priya, who had been at Caldwell for 14 months and had done most of the modeling work. "Your revenue growth assumptions are also based on Meridian's management projections. But if you pull their last 4 years of actuals and weight them against the sector trend, you get something closer to 4%, not 7%. The difference compounds." Priya looked down at her laptop. She opened a spreadsheet. She looked at it. She closed it. "Who are you?" one of the senior partners asked. His name was Douglas Wren, and he was the kind of man who asked questions the same way other people make statements. "I work in facilities," Bernard said. "I've been with the building for about 8 months. Before that?" Douglas said. Bernard considered the question. "Other things," he said. The story of how Bernard Okafor ended up pushing a cleaning cart through the offices of Caldwell Capital Partners at 6 in the morning is not a story of tragedy. He would be the first to say so, and he had said so on the few occasions when someone had thought to ask. He had been for 22 years a portfolio manager at a firm called Hargrove Meridian Asset Management, no relation to the Meridian Media Group currently under discussion, where he had built and managed a multi-strategy fund that, at its peak, held just under $4 billion in assets. He had been good at his job in the quiet, sustained way that doesn't generate magazine profiles or conference keynotes. He had simply been right, more often than not, about things that mattered. He had 1 daughter. Her name was Claudine, and she was 33. And she lived in Portland with her husband and their 2 children. and Bernard called her every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock regardless of what else was happening. When his wife, Loretta, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 58, Bernard had made a decision that his colleagues considered either deeply admirable or professionally catastrophic, depending on which colleague you asked. He had left Hargrove Meridian. He had taken Loretta to the house they had always talked about buying, a quiet place outside Savannah with a garden and no neighbors close enough to bother them, and he had spent 4 years there, caring for her. She died in February of the previous year. She had been comfortable. She had known where she was for most of it. Bernard had sold the Savannah house in the spring and moved to Atlanta because Claudine had asked him to, gently, in the way adult children ask things when they are worried about a parent but do not want to presume. He did not want to impose on her household, so he rented an apartment in Buckhead. He took the facilities job at Vantage Tower because he wanted something to do in the mornings, and because he had always found, somewhat to his own surprise, that physical work steadied him in ways that sitting still did not. He was not in financial distress. He was not rebuilding. He was simply a man who had survived something enormous and was figuring out, quietly, what came next. After the meeting, Douglas Wren found Bernard in the east corridor, changing a hallway light fixture. "Do you have 5 minutes?" Douglas asked. Bernard stepped down from the small stepladder. "Yes." They sat in the small break room off the main kitchen. Douglas had brought 2 coffees. He set one in front of Bernard without asking whether he wanted it. "Where did you do your analysis?" Douglas said. "I didn't do an analysis," Bernard said. "I read your documents upside down for about 90 seconds. You identified a 2.7 multiple discrepancy in 90 seconds. The one-time items were disclosed in the footnotes of the summary page. Most people don't read footnotes." Douglas looked at him steadily. "What did you do before this?" Bernard told him. Not all of it. He wasn't a man who told all of anything to someone he'd known for 6 minutes, but enough. Hargrove Meridian, the fund, the years. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you be willing to look at the full Meridian file? Properly." "As a consultant, I'd need to think about it," Bernard said. "That's a fair answer," Douglas said. Bernard picked up the coffee. It was better than the coffee in the facilities break room, which was not saying much. "What did Voss say?" he asked. "After I left." Douglas's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. He said it was probably beginner's luck, that you'd heard something around the building and were showing off. Bernard nodded slowly. "And what did you think?" "I thought," Douglas said, "that a man who reads footnotes upside down from 12 feet away is not showing off. He's not even trying." What followed was not a triumphant montage. Bernard did not walk into Caldwell Capital Partners in a new suit and take a corner office. He continued pushing his cart in the mornings. He took the Meridian file home on a Thursday evening, read it over the weekend, and returned it Monday with a 12-page memorandum that he had typed single-spaced in Times New Roman, because he had never particularly trusted the aesthetics of bullet points when it came to serious financial analysis. The memorandum identified 7 material risks in the acquisition structure. It proposed a revised valuation methodology. It included a comparable transactions analysis that Priya, who had since read it twice, later described to a colleague as the kind of work you don't see very often from anyone, at any level. Douglas Wren shared it with the other senior partners. He did not share who had written it until after they had read it. Harlan Voss read it last. He set it down on his desk and sat with it for a moment. "This is from the janitor," he said. "It was not a question." "He prefers Bernard," Douglas said. "But yes." "It's wrong," Harlan said. "Which part?" Douglas asked. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He picked up the memo again, turned to the 3rd page, and pointed at a paragraph without reading it aloud. "This section. The revenue assumptions. Priya ran the revised model last night," Douglas said. "His numbers hold. Priya is 26 years old. She was right about the real estate comps in the Memphis deal last year," Douglas said. "You said so yourself at the time." Something moved across Harlan's face. It was not quite anger, and not quite embarrassment, and not quite anything that had a clean name. "This firm has a reputation," he said. "We don't take advice from maintenance staff. We take advice from people who are right," Douglas said. "We always have." Harlan stood up. "Get him out of the building." The dismissal came on a Wednesday. Bernard was informed by the building's facilities manager, a decent man named Terry, who clearly found the whole situation uncomfortable and kept apologizing in ways that weren't quite apologies. The reason given was restructuring of services. There was a modest severance check that Bernard looked at once and set aside. He called Claudine that evening, not on Sunday, which was unusual, and which she noticed immediately. "What happened?" she said. He told her, not the full arc of it, but enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not sure yet," Bernard said. "I may look at the garden situation. The apartment building has a courtyard that nobody uses, Dad," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm fine, Claudine. I want you to know that. I'm genuinely fine." She wasn't sure she believed him entirely, but she knew her father well enough to know that when he said something in that particular tone, steady, unhurried, factual, he was telling the truth as he understood it. Bernard Okafor had never been a man who catastrophized. It was one of the things that had made him good at his job, and, she suspected, something that had helped him through the years with her mother. What neither of them knew, on that Wednesday evening, was that the Meridian deal was beginning to come apart. The problem surfaced 3 weeks later. It surfaced the way financial problems usually surface, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated weight of small inconsistencies that suddenly, upon examination, resolve into something much larger and much more serious. The deal team had proceeded without Bernard's revised valuation. They had adjusted some minor assumptions, enough to say, internally, that his concerns had been addressed, but the core structure remained unchanged. The entry multiple was still inflated. The revenue projections were still management-sourced. The deal was scheduled to close in 6 weeks. It was Douglas Wren who first noticed that the due diligence report on Meridian's streaming division didn't reconcile with the subscriber data they'd been provided. He pulled the underlying data himself at 9 in the evening and sat with it until close to midnight, and then he did something that required, for a man of his institutional seniority, a certain amount of deliberate humility. He called Bernard. "I need to ask you something," Douglas said, when Bernard answered. "It's late," Bernard said, but he wasn't reproving, just noting, "I know, I'm sorry. You mentioned in the memo that the streaming segment was the critical growth assumption. I want to know what you saw." Bernard was quiet for a moment. In the background, Douglas could hear what sounded like a television on low volume. "Where are you in the subscriber reconciliation?" Bernard asked. "I'm looking at a 60,000 unit gap between their reported actuals and the platform data." 74,000, Bernard said. "When you account for the trial conversions, they're counting as paid subscribers." A long silence. "You already knew," Douglas said. "I flagged it on page 9 of the memo," Bernard said. Footnote, Douglas turned to page 9. There it was. He had read the memo 3 times. "How did you get the platform data?" "It's in their SEC filing from 18 months ago, Bernard said. "Not the summary, the exhibit." Douglas sat back in his chair. Outside his office window, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta does at midnight, glowing quietly, unhurried. "If we close this deal at current structure," he said, "we're looking at a significant impairment within 18 months. 22 months, Bernard said. "But the direction is the same. What would you do if you were running this?" Bernard considered the question with the patience he gave to most things, not rushing, not performing. "I'd go back to Meridian and renegotiate the price. The gap in their subscriber data is potentially a material misrepresentation. That's leverage. You could either restructure the deal at a number that makes sense, or you walk away with your reputation intact." "Harlan won't like it," Douglas said. "Harlan likes being right more than he likes being wrong publicly," Bernard said. "Most people do. Give him a way to present it as the firm's diligence working as it should." "You're being generous," Douglas said, "to a man who had you fired." Bernard's response was not what Douglas expected. He didn't deflect. He didn't offer forgiveness, which would have been its own kind of performance. He said, "I'm not being generous, I'm being accurate. Harlan is not the most important thing in this situation. The deal is the most important thing. If the deal goes badly, everyone loses. The firm, the partners, the people who've invested in this fund. That matters more than what Harlan thinks of me." Douglas said nothing for a moment. "Can I send you something?" he said finally. "Tonight? Tomorrow morning, the full updated data room." Another pause. "All right," Bernard said. The senior partners meeting happened on a Tuesday, and for the first 45 minutes it went the way Harlan had anticipated. He presented the deal on schedule. The analysts walked through the model. The outside counsel confirmed the legal timeline. Then Douglas asked to show something. He put up a single slide. It contained 4 numbers. He explained what they were and where they came from and what they meant for the projected return on the acquisition. The room went very quiet. "Where did this come from?" one of the other senior partners asked. His name was Richard Cho, and he was the kind of man who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. "An outside analysis," Douglas said. "Who ran it?" Douglas glanced at Harlan, not with satisfaction, with something more measured than that. Bernard Okafor identified the core issue 6 weeks ago. I've spent the last 2 weeks running down his methodology independently. It holds. Harlan's expression didn't collapse. He was too experienced for that, too practiced in the discipline of maintaining composure in rooms where money was at stake. But something in his posture changed in a way that everyone present registered and no one mentioned. "Bernard Okafor," Richard said. "The name isn't familiar to me. He was with the building's facilities team." Douglas said. The room absorbed this. "He was let go," Richard said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Douglas said. Richard looked at Harlan. Harlan was looking at the slide. "Get him on the phone," Richard said. Bernard was in the courtyard behind his apartment building, which had in fact turned out to be exactly as underutilized as he'd suspected. He had persuaded the building manager to let him plant a small raised bed in the corner, and he was doing something careful with soil amendments when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said, "I appreciate the call. We'd like to bring you in," Richard said. "Not as a consultant. We'd like to talk about a more formal arrangement." "I'll think about it," Bernard said. "Can I have until Friday?" There was a pause that suggested this was not the response Richard Cho was accustomed to receiving. "Of course," Richard said. After he hung up, Bernard set the phone on the edge of the raised bed. He finished what he was doing with the soil. He washed his hands with the hose. He sat on the small bench he'd placed in the corner of the courtyard and looked at the afternoon light moving across the brick wall. He thought about Loretta, the way he still did, daily, not with grief that incapacitated, but with a kind of constant gentle awareness of her absence, the way you might be aware of a room in a house that you no longer enter but still know is there. He thought about what she would have said. She had always been very good at cutting through the noise of his deliberations to the thing that actually mattered. She would have said, "What do you want, Bernard? Not what's right, not what's fair. What do you want?" He thought about it for a while in the quiet afternoon. Then he called Claudine. "I need your opinion on something," he said when she picked up. "That's new," she said. She was smiling, he could tell. "Don't enjoy it too much," he said. "They've offered me a position at Caldwell." A pause. "The firm that fired you." "Yes, and I want to know what you think," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide. I just want to know what you think." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear, faintly, the sound of his grandchildren somewhere in the background of her house, the specific domestic tumble of small people who don't know they're being overheard. "I think," Claudine said carefully, "that you've been filling your days with things that are fine, but that aren't quite right for you. And I think you know the difference between hiding and resting, and I think Mom would say the same thing." Bernard was quiet. "She would also say," Claudine added, "that you should charge them an unreasonable amount of money, because you didn't spend 22 years being right about things to go back to work at a discount." He laughed. It was a real laugh, quiet and unguarded, the kind that costs nothing. "I'll tell you what I decide on Friday," he said. "I'll be waiting," she said. He went in on Thursday. He had not called ahead. He had no appointment. He wore the same things he always wore, clean dark pants, a collared shirt, shoes that were several years old but well maintained. He asked the lobby security desk for Douglas Wren, and while he waited, he sat in one of the chairs in the atrium and read a section of the newspaper he'd folded into his jacket pocket. Douglas came down himself, which Bernard noted. They sat in a small conference room on the 4th floor, not the main one, and Bernard said what he had decided. He would accept a consulting arrangement, not a staff position, because he had no interest in staff positions. He would work on specific transactions as requested, with the ability to decline any engagement he found objectionable for any reason he chose not to explain. His rate was a number that Douglas wrote down without expression, which itself told Bernard something. "That's fair," Douglas said. "I know," Bernard said. "One more thing," Douglas said. He paused in a way that suggested he was choosing his next words deliberately. Harlan will still be here. He's a senior partner. You'd encounter him. Bernard considered this. That's all right, he said. He's not. Douglas started. I know what he is, Bernard said, not harshly. It doesn't concern me. What he thinks of me doesn't change what I see in a spreadsheet. Douglas looked at him for a moment. You're a very unusual person, he said. I've been told, Bernard said. The Meridian deal was renegotiated. Caldwell returned to the table with the subscriber discrepancy documented and presented as evidence of material misrepresentation. The deal eventually closed, 6 months later, at a price 11% lower than the original structure, with protections built in that Bernard had specified in a 2-page addendum that Priya, who had been brought into the revised process, later framed as the clearest acquisition risk summary she had read in her career. Harlan Voss did not acknowledge Bernard directly, not then, not in the months that followed. He moved through the office with the particular careful dignity of a man who has been wrong about something important, and has decided that the most viable path forward is to simply continue being himself with great consistency. Bernard didn't require acknowledgement. This was something people had trouble believing about him at first, and then, after they had worked alongside him for a while, simply accepted as part of the way he was built. He consulted on 4 more transactions over the following year. He was right about 3 of them in ways that were obvious only in retrospect, and about the 4th in ways that were never publicly acknowledged but that Douglas Wren noted in the margin of his own copy of the file. He still called Claudine every Sunday at 7 o'clock. The raised bed in the courtyard had, by spring, produced an embarrassing quantity of tomatoes, which he distributed among his neighbors with the same unhurried generosity he brought to most things, not as performance, not as statement, but simply because there were too many tomatoes for one man, and it seemed wasteful not to share. One morning in March, Priya passed him in the elevator. She was carrying 2 coffees and a folder, and the particular expression of someone who has been at work since before sunrise. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Okafor," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "Thank you for the subscriber thing. The way you laid it out in the memo, I've been using that framework on my own time." Bernard looked at her for a moment. She was young, he thought, in the way that people are young when they still believe that the distance between where they are and where they want to be is primarily a matter of effort. She was probably right about that, for now. "You already knew how to look for it," he said. "You just needed to see that it was worth looking." The elevator opened on her floor. "Have a good morning," he said. She smiled, a real one, briefly startled into existence, and walked out into the corridor, and Bernard rode the elevator down to the lobby and out into the morning, which was the kind of March morning that Atlanta does occasionally without warning. Soft air, thin light, the city not yet decided between winter and something else. He turned up his collar and walked, unhurried, toward the parking garage, and the day continued as days do, forward and carrying everything.